Which devices in 2019 are going to be supported when iOS 13 drops later this year, and which ones are not going to make it? Which devices are going to die with iOS 12 being the latest possible version they can get? Speculation of which devices are going to survive and not survive are flooding the internet right now, so I thought weighing the options and looking at some of the evidence would be a good idea in today's video. Let's begin. So according to an analyst site called The Verifier, there's some not so great news that a lot of people are not happy with going around. The news is iOS 13 is going to be obviously canceling a few more Apple product services, but that's typical with most iOS updates, unless it's something special like iOS 12, which I suppose a lot of people out there would consider more of an iOS 11s. You know, it wasn't a huge upgrade, but I don't think it was really intended to be. It was supposed to be a small upgrade that was more about performance boosting, stabilizing as many iOS devices as possible, and making them more reliable, and that's how iOS 12 was able to be supported all the way back to the iPhone 5S. But with this new report from The Verifier, they're saying iOS 13 will not even be available on iPhones as recent as the iPhone 6S and the iPhone SE. And this, of course, is upsetting a lot of people out there and also creating, rightfully, a lot of skepticism. A lot of people are seeing this going, really? Would they discontinue phones that they literally sold just a year ago? I definitely have grown a little bit skeptic of this report as well for a couple reasons. Primarily not about the iPhones themselves, because sure, I could understand that the iPhone 6S has 3D touch, and that's kind of one of the big features Apple's trying to kill, but it also has the headphone jack. The SE is an entirely separate form factor that they have to design iOS for. Like, no other iPhone right now is that small or has a display that's 4 inches, so having to have an entire dedicated team of the iOS department just to making iOS 13 compatible with the 4-inch iPhone would probably take a lot of resources, but ignoring and putting all that aside, my reason to believe that this is probably not a real report is the 2017 iPad. Keep in mind that's not terribly that long ago considering that 2019 just started, but the 2017 iPad shipped with an A9 chip as well as an M9 motion coprocessor. It's the same CPU, and that coprocessor is the same found in the iPhone 6S and the iPhone SE. Obviously, it's nowhere near as fast as an iPhone 7's A10 chip, but the idea that Apple would release a product in 2017, and usually when they design a product, they release it, they intend for people to use it for a few years at least. And the idea that they would discontinue that only 2 years after being launched is a very short window of iOS support for an Apple product, particularly after last year where they advertised iOS 12 supporting iPhones as old as the 5S, and we're giving all the support and we're getting to have products that last a long time for a good long while. So the fact that that iPad with the A9 chip shipped in 2017 and would likely be bunched in with the devices that are not getting supported because it has the same CPU architecture as the 6S and the SE makes me think, would Apple really cancel support for a product that quickly? They don't usually, and that's why when I read this report, I definitely am a little bit cautious to believe it. I think, well, you know, maybe iOS 13 is intended to be a big update. You know, I'll play devil's advocate here and say maybe why this is a good idea, or potentially even this is good news you should be excited for. Perhaps Apple's trying to learn from their mistakes and know that when they make drastic design changes to iOS and they do enormous design overhauls to the software to make things different, that can end up bogging down and slowing down a lot of older hardware, because obviously that older hardware was not designed to run the software being designed in 2019. So perhaps their reasoning with not keeping around phones that are just as recent as the iPhone 6S, the SE, the 2017 iPad is because they want to end those devices' lifespan on a happy note. Apple wanted to focus and nail down on all the bugs and glitches that iOS 11 caused for a lot of devices out there and say, let's end a lot of these devices like the 5S and the 6. Let's give them iOS 12 as their last update, and that way they'll keep running at good performance, they'll get fairly modern features, and then that's how we'll close on them. And then iOS 13, which a lot of people are anticipating to be a big design change, a big graphical overhaul with lots of new features, things like a dark mode or home screen changes that a lot of people have been asking for years. Perhaps Apple doesn't want to burden all of those really old devices with iOS 13, because in the end, that could end up slowing them down drastically, and that could end up meaning those devices die on a sour note, on a bad day, and that means that if you update your old iPhone to the latest version of iOS, it's going to get a lot slower and a lot laggier, because all of the new changes in iOS 13 will be primarily for all of the newer iPhones that we already have. So, on the other hand, I could see what maybe they're trying to do with canceling iOS support so early for a lot of these devices. Like, if you bought an iPhone 5S on launch day, you really lucked out. You got a long time of support. But it would kind of suck if someone bought an iPhone 6S just a couple years ago, and now already they can't get the latest iOS. I completely agree with you. That would stink. And part of the reason a lot of people buy Apple products is because of that longevity, and they know they're going to get routine iOS updates year after year. In my mind, it makes complete sense that with iOS 13, we will see the iPhone 5S won't be able to get it as well as the iPhone 6. Those devices are getting old enough and slow enough that I think it's fair for Apple to say, you know what, we gave these devices a long amount of support. They've got a lot of attention from us, but it's time to move on, and we're going to raise the minimum requirements for iOS 13. I think that's completely fair, but I think it would also line up with a lot more of our predictions and with consistency in the past that iOS 13 would at least work on the iPhone 6S, the SE, and the 2017 iPad. At least give those devices another year, because in the grand scheme of products that Apple serviced in the long term, they're really not that old. I get that they're not new, you know, there's a lot that's happened after the release of the 6S, iPhone 7, iPhone 8, iPhone 10, now 10S, 10R. There's been a lot that's come out since then, but if Apple wants to keep up their reputation of supporting devices in the long term and not leaving devices behind, their ideology of supporting devices for a while, it would really make a lot of sense to make sure that that 6S gets iOS 13. And as stressful as this may be for the Apple iOS team, yeah, that means making sure that the iPhone SE can still get iOS 13 in 2019. I know that it probably won't get all of the major features people are hoping for, and it's probably a big stress for Apple because most of the devices they're working on are the iPhone 10, the 10S Max, the 10R. Designing the operating system to work on 6.5-inch displays, not even to mention iOS 13 supporting the 13-inch iPad Pro, having to design iOS to work on all these different screens and still making time in the schedule and making time in the budget for the 4-inch iPhone that still has the design scheme of the iPhone 5, still keeping that supported. I get it. It's probably stressful, and it's probably a lot of work for not a lot of payoff because a ton of people who use the SE in 2019 may not be using the latest version of iOS anyway. But hey, Apple was selling the iPhone SE on the clearance section of their website not too long ago, so I don't think it's too unreasonable, Apple, if you're still selling the SE, to keep supporting it in 2019. I imagine most of you out there would agree with me. I'd hate to see it go the way that the verifier is predicting, because that would mean that iOS 12 wasn't exactly a specialty year. It just meant that we were going to have to pay for the discontinuation of a lot of Apple products the year after. Like, a lot of us were happy to see that, hey, iOS 12 supports all the same devices iOS 11 does. This is great. We get longevity for these products. But then if it ends up a year later, meaning that we have to cut off 2 generations of products and not just one, I think most of us are used to one generation being cut off every iOS update. But then that means bad news for a lot of people out there that were hoping for the latest iOS, but just can't get it because they bought an iPhone 3 to 4 years ago at this point. I think this is one of Apple's strong suits. This is something they do well, is support devices and let customers know that when they buy an iPhone, it's going to last them a while. But I also can understand the viewpoint that iOS 12 is probably a really good, safe, not too fancy, just stable, performance boosting version of iOS to end a lot of Apple products' lifespan on, and then only devices with the processor speed or the capability to handle all of the changes coming can actually get iOS 13. Those are my thoughts on it. Let me know what you guys are thinking down in the comments below. This is your Apple Sheep here. I'll see you in the next one.